Hello, Dawn of Faith viewers. Welcome to our today's episode. Today we are going to look at a story in Acts chapter 12. Our today's episode is entitled, Man's Extremity is God's Opportunity. And before that, let's believe and pray. Our dear Jesus, may you tabernacle with us, and oh Lord, may you rest in our souls, give us peace. And throughout these turbulent times, may you be with us now and forevermore. In Jesus' name I do pray and believe. Amen. Now, our story comes from the book of Acts chapter 12. Now, the time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. Now, when I read this story, I did that deep research about Herod, this Herod. This Herod is not the Herod that crucified Jesus. This was a different Herod that came after that Herod. And so if you see Herod, all those Herods, Herod number one, the one who killed the infants when Jesus had been born, and there's another Herod that killed John the Baptist, and this other Herod that we are seeing that he's killing James, the brother of John. Now if you look at it, this Herod was a firm believer in the Jewish law. That's why you are seeing, and because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. Now he believed in the law, the Jewish law, that you could not convict someone privately. It had to be a public hearing. By 2 or 3 witnesses shall a matter be established. And so that's why he apprehended him. Verse 4, and when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. So he was a firm believer in the law, and he wanted to have a public hearing. First was to thwart any dissenting voice, and another one was also to establish that he was the supreme ruler. And you see in verse 3, he's saying, and because he saw it pleased the Jews. And one of the reasons that made him to apprehend, because Peter was the head of the movement. And so by apprehending Peter, it meant that he would have thwarted the whole movement. And so he went ahead and apprehended Peter. And so if you look at the imagery presented here, Peter was placed between 2 soldiers and was bound by 2 chains, each chain being fastened to the wrist of one of the soldiers. And so if Peter moves, the soldiers will be awakened. If Peter does anything mischievous, the soldiers will know. That was the first line of defense, because if he moves, since his wrist was bound between one of those soldiers, it meant that if he moves, that was the first line of defense. And number 2, the doors were securely fastened. So by any human laws, by any human standard, there was no way that Peter would escape. But as the title of this devotion says, man's extremity is God's opportunity. Now when all hope was lost, when by science, by mathematics, by reason, when it was deemed that Peter's cause was lost, in verse 7, now God seizes this thing. Now when human laws fail to protect God's people, when God's people have reached at a point where there is no help that is coming, now God steps in. Now in verse 7, and behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison, and he smote Peter on the side. Now we're seeing there's something funny here. We're seeing that amidst these perplexities, amidst these trials, we are seeing Peter sleeping like a babe. Because we are told that the angel smote him and raised him. So meaning he was sleeping. And so it gives us an imagery of Jesus Christ when he was in the midst of the tempest. When the disciples were crying, fearing for their lives, Christ was just sleeping like a babe. And also Peter here, when his life was almost being cut short, when principalities and powers had surrounded him, we are seeing Peter sleeping like a babe because he knew there was a higher power than all these human principalities, than all powers. There was a power above all powers, the power of God. And so he entrusted his life to God. And we're seeing that God rewarded his faith. He sent forth an angel. Now, and the angel said unto him, Gird thyself and bind on thy sandals. And so he did. And he said unto him, Cast thy garments about thee and follow me. And he went out and followed him, and wist not that it was true, which was done by the angel, but though he saw a vision. Now, when Peter through all this deal, he thought he was sleeping. He thought he was seeing a vision. But verse 10 we are told, when they were past the first and the second ward, they came unto the iron gate that leaded unto the city, which opened to them of his own accord. And they went out and passed on through one street, and forthwith the angel departed from him. Now we are seeing there are all these doors. They are being opened effortlessly. There's no noise. It's not awakening the guards. And Peter is passing through, and there's this beautiful scene, because we're told that the angel lighted up. And when he had, we are told in verse 11, and when Peter was come to himself, he said, now I know of a surety that the Lord has sent his angel and had delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from the all expectation of the people of the Jews. Now we're told here one thing, that when he was passing through this entire ordeal, he thought that it was a vision. But now when the angel had departed and darkness had settled in and he came to his senses, he knew, oh, this was not a vision. This beautiful scenery was God delivering him. And so he praised the Lord, and he knows for a surety that the Lord had sent his angel and had delivered him out of the hands of Herod and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. Now the expectation of the people of the Jews had expected that Peter was going to be publicly executed. But God had thwarted all these plans. And we clearly see here that man's extremity is God's opportunity. Now we go on in verse 11, and when Peter was come to himself, he said, now for sure that the Lord had sent his angel and had delivered me out of the hand of Herod and from the expectation of the people of the Jews. And when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken, named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran and told how Peter stood before the gate. Now, the damsel named Rhoda, when she heard the voice of Peter, she was gladdened and went and told the people who were with him. Now, when the people that were with him were told of this thing, they thought that she was mad. But she kept on insisting and insisting and insisting. And so Peter was also knocking constantly and constantly. And when they went and opened and then they saw Peter, they were glad because they were praying for Peter. Because had Peter died, it would have crushed their hopes. They were constantly praying for him, and God had answered that persistent prayer. And so, brothers and sisters, you might be praying for a thing. You might be praying for something. Just as God answered the prayers of these people who are praying for Peter, God also can answer your prayer. The hope might be lost. You might be thinking that there's no help that is coming. But today's episode is telling us man's extremity is God's opportunity. Now, the story does not just end like that. In verse 18, now as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers what was become of Peter. Because they tried to see how Peter had escaped. They could not figure out how he did it. And they knew it was not humanly possible for Peter to escape. And when Herod had sought for him and found him not, he examined the keepers and commanded that they should put to death. Now Herod knew that because if you look at how he commanded them to be put to death, it seemed that when he had put them in charge of Peter, he had commanded them that should Peter escape, their lives also, they will be put to death. And so Herod knew that these soldiers knew the gravity of this situation and the efforts that they had put to make sure that Peter would not escape. And so he knew it was not humanly possible for Peter to escape. There was a divine power that was in play. But still he went ahead and commanded the soldiers to be put to death. And he went down from Judah to Caesarea and there abode. And Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon. But they came on accord to him, and having made Blastus the king's chamberlain their friend, desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country. And upon a set day Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne and made an oration unto them. Now, Herod, if you see the activities of Herod in Acts 12, Herod always sought the praise of others. And so this speech, he carefully crafted it, and he mastered it, and he adorned in the most beautiful of apparel. And so he masterly delivered this speech, and the people gave a shout saying, it's the voice of God and not of a man. Now, there's something that is very funny here. Now, just by one speech, and so you see these people were drunk, and because it was a feast, they were marrying, and just a speech and just beautiful apparel, they were ready to exclaim that this is not just a man, but he was a God. But these same people had witnessed the power of Jesus Christ. They had witnessed him doing miracles, but they were unwilling to acknowledge that the mighty works that Christ had done, that he was God, but just a man with a mere speech, they were willing to exclaim that he was a God. You can see how the hatred they had for God, that they were willing to exclaim just a mere man that had not done anything excellent but just to speak well. But the man that had done mighty work, they were not willing to recognize him as from God or as God. But all they could do was crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And the people gave shout, saying, "It's the voice of God and not of a man." And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory. Now, the angel of the Lord smote Herod. But in verse 7 of the same book, we are told the angel of the Lord smote Peter on the side. Now, I tend to believe this might have been the same angel. The angel who brought deliverance to Peter brought judgment to Herod. Now, if we look at these two instances, there are two smiting. Now, there was one instance where the angel smote Peter, but that smiting brought deliverance unto Peter. But we are seeing here in verse 23 that there's a different smiting. It's the same hand, but deliverance, and in verse 23, judgment. And so, it's very, very intriguing indeed. But why would the angel struck Herod to death? Now, you know, Herod, as I told you, was familiar with the law of the Jews. Because if you look at his actions, he could not kill Peter just the way he killed James. He had to do a public execution. Because in Jewish law, it was not prudent to determine a matter privately. It had to be determined publicly. And so he was well acquainted with it gives us a hint that he was well acquainted with the law. In Exodus chapter 20, the Bible tells us, "You shall not have any other God besides me." And so Herod knew that all glory belonged to God. And so by accepting the praises of the people that he was a God, he was contravening that law. That's number one. And number two, Herod also had known that arresting Peter and arresting James, he knew these people were innocent and he knew they were representing God. And so, but having known all these facts, that he was contravening the law of God, and he knew, because if you read this passage carefully, he was well acquainted with the law. But yet, in this instance, he did not give glory to God. And so the angel of the Lord smote him. And it explains it because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms and gave up ghosts. Now, friends, in this story, we get two smitings. You can be smote, or you can be smote to judgment. If you align with yourself with God, his smiting will be of deliverance. But if you align with self to work against God, you will be smitten to justice, just like Herod. But all we can see here in this story, it's very beautiful. It starts with despair, but ends up with justice, mercy, and deliverance. And so, friends, I want to tell you, you might be passing through troubles. You must be having issues with life. You might have reached the end. You are heartbroken. You are passing through issues. And by human standards, by human wisdom, you've been deemed that your case is hopeless. But this story is giving us that man's extremity is God's opportunity. And in the midst of trouble, let's be like Peter. Let's have peace and sleep, knowing that the God of the universe is with us. And let's not knowingly do evil, because Herod knew what he was doing was evil. But in that very instant, God reminded him that though the people had seen him as a great ruler, but there was a power above all powers, the power of God. May God bless you. See you again in our next episode.